So we're going to start talking about the system as a whole. We already talked about the hormones and categorization of them, and we'll actually go through the rest of this chapter in more detail on each of the separate hormones and how they actually have impacts within your system. So we will come back to that. But keep in mind, your endocrine system includes organs whose primary function is production of hormones or paraffin. Remember last time I told you that potentially we could say almost any organ is a part of the endocrine system because secondarily a lot of organs do produce hormones, and we'll get into that. But here's the ones we consider that are primarily endocrine organs: hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid gland, adrenal gland, pancreas, pineal gland, parathyroid glands. And a lot of other organs have tissues, as I said, that do secrete hormones. But the endocrine function is secondary in some of those. So the heart produces some hormones. You may not know that. The thymus, the digestive tract itself produces hormones. Your kidneys do, and your gonads. Okay, so looking at this chart, you see where these different organs are, or parts. The hypothalamus, you know from the nervous system. It is the lower part of the diencephalon, the upper part of that area of the diencephalon is the thalamus. This upper area, and the lower area is the hypothalamus. Then we have the pituitary gland at the front that comes off of a small stalk. To the back of the brain, there is a small gland called the pineal gland. As we move down, we have the parathyroid glands, which are on each side of the trachea on top of the thyroid gland. Make sure you're able to identify these when you go to laboratory. Then you have the thyroid gland, which is the more enlarged glands around the trachea. The parathyroid glands really are these four little spots on each side of the thyroid gland. Then the adrenal gland is right above the kidneys. And then the pancreas you find right here below and behind the stomach. So that is the pancreas. These show the secondary endocrine organs: heart, thymus, digestive tract, kidneys, and gonads, of course. So again, they are considered secondary endocrine organs. So let's get into detail of each of these separate ones. The hypothalamus secretes hormones involved in fluid balance, smooth muscle contraction, control of hormone secretion, also by the anterior pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus controls other hormones for the anterior pituitary gland, and that's quite important. We'll get into that later. Then you have the pituitary gland, and we actually do separate the pituitary gland into anterior and posterior pituitary because each operates somewhat separately as far as the hormones that it produces. It secretes lots of hormones that regulate many functions, things that have impacted the adrenal cortex, the thyroid gland, the reproductive organs, and also it has a hormone that stimulates melanin production that's produced here. Okay, the thyroid gland, which is around the trachea and voice box area, secretes hormones that affect metabolic rate and calcium ion levels in body fluids. You probably often hear of people having trouble with the thyroid gland, especially true in females, whether you have hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism. We'll talk more about that later also and why that does hit females more as a problem. My wife, as a matter of fact, has hypothyroidism. Adrenal glands, there's two adrenal glands that secrete hormones involved with mineral balance, metabolic control, resistance to stress. Where do you find the adrenal glands? They're right on top of the kidney. They also release epinephrine and norepinephrine during sympathetic activation. Does anybody know what epinephrine and norepinephrine are involved in primarily? primary thing we think of when we think of those. We used to call those, by the way, something different, adrenaline and noradrenaline. It ramps you up. For what reason? What do we call that response? Fight or flight response. And again, it says it's under sympathetic activation. And you'll remember from studying the nervous system, sympathetic activation is usually the ramping up side of the nervous system. What's the opposite side usually of sympathetic? It's usually down registering. Sounds like sympathetic. Parasympathetic. Okay, the pancreas, specifically the pancreatic islets. And you're going to want to make sure in laboratory that you look at this slide and you find the pancreatic islets in that slide, because you will see slides of that again, both in on quizzes as well as the midterm lab exam. And many of you probably know what the pancreas does. Secretes hormones that regulate the rate of glucose uptake, utilization by body tissues. Specifically, what hormone do you associate with the pancreas? Insulin. The pineal gland, this is at the back of the lower part of the brain. It secretes melatonin, which affects reproductive function and circadian rhythms. And therefore, you associate melatonin with what? Sleep habits. And then parathyroid glands secrete hormones that are important for regulation of calcium ion levels in your body fluids. So these hormones are going to impact the cells of your bones quite often. We'll talk more about that. You remember from 168 that you have osteoblasts that build bone. So they actually take up calcium, and they build bone, they store that calcium. You have osteoclasts that break down bone and release calcium. Bones are a major reserve for calcium. And then, as we said, other organs do have endocrine function, but we say it's secondary. The heart produces hormones that are involved with regulation of blood volumes and pressures. The thymus with immune responses. The digestive tract with digestive function, obviously, in that coordination. But glucose metabolism, also appetite. Your kidneys themselves will release hormones that are involved with blood cell production, the rate of calcium and phosphorus absorption by your digestive tract, enzyme that's involved in regulating your blood pressure. The gonads, both for the males and females, produce hormones that are regulating growth and metabolism and sexual characteristics and activities of the organs in the reproductive system. There's lots of different organs there to think about. We will be going through these in more detail. Now, the hormones are very specific in what they affect. And the way that they're very specific is they will bind to very specific receptors on very specific cells of very specific tissues. So it targets certain cells. And that target cell has to have the receptor that recognizes that hormone. Without the receptor, the circulating hormone has no effect whatsoever. And you're going to see there's some disorders that are associated with losing these receptors, like in certain types of diabetes. Cells also have receptors for a lot of different hormones. There's different combinations of receptors that produce different effects on the tissues. Some tissues have more than one receptor for more than one hormone. So where are you going to find these receptors? Well, there's two possible receptor locations on the cells. in the plasma membrane itself, and we call this an extracellular receptor. So the plasma membrane is the membrane that is on the outer part of the cell. It kind of holds everything in, right, and regulates what goes in and out of the cell. So receptors for catecholamines and peptide hormones and most of your eicosanoids are we found on the plasma membranes. And the way it works is the receptors will bind to the hormones, which then cause other messengers to be released. So the hormones are first messengers. They relay a message intracellularly inside to a second messenger. Another chemical inside then affects enzyme activity, and that changes the metabolic reactions inside the cell. And that's what gives you the effects of the hormone in the cell. This usually involves a G protein. So whenever you hear the term G protein, think receptors involved with the plasma membrane. We're talking about extracellular receptors. So again, this is one of the ways, or one of the places we're going to find receptors for the hormones. Extracellular receptors. Okay, and this graphic from your book shows the hormone binding as a primary messenger and activating another chemical as a secondary messenger inside. And again, it's usually a G protein that is being activated inside of the cell, which then causes some kind of change in enzyme activity. And they show a couple of examples here. Here we have effects on CAMP levels. They change the concentration of that particular chemical, and that then has an impact on other things inside, like it opens ion channels or it activates other enzymes. Or, in the second case, it reduces enzyme activity. Or, in this third example, it has effects on calcium levels. It can actually open calcium channels to bring in more calcium, which then activates enzymes. Or it activates the G protein that releases a lot of stored calcium and then binds to another chemical called calmodulin, which also activates enzymes. So again, in both places, we have the hormone bind to a receptor on the plasma membrane, causing something to change inside the cell. Okay, and these next couple slides just reiterate what was just on that previous slide. It gives this first example, which is cyclic AMP, which is a derivative of ATP. Increased levels of that can activate enzymes, or it can open ion channels, and that will cause metabolic activity to increase, or have decreased levels that are inhibitory on the cell. They can also have impacts on the calcium ions, which showed in that second part of that earlier picture. They function in combination with intracellular protein that we call calmodulin. So this is the same picture we just showed previous to that. And don't worry about all those extreme details there. Do go by my study guide for the exam for the detail that I'm expecting. This is a quick video clip that explains some of that.
The endocrine system consists of hormone-producing tissues located throughout the body. The circulating hormones control the rates of body processes and maintain homeostasis. Within an endocrine gland, endocrine cells secrete hormones, which diffuse into nearby capillaries. The cardiovascular system transports these hormones throughout the body, affecting target cells in various tissues. Target cells for a specific hormone have receptors that bind the unique three-dimensional shape of that hormone. Cells that lack a specific hormone receptor are unresponsive to that hormone, even if a high concentration of the hormone is present around the cells. Although cells express a variety of receptors, we'll focus on one particular class: receptors that bind water-soluble hormones and exert their effects through the intracellular second messenger, cyclic AMP. These receptors are embedded in the cell's plasma membrane because water-soluble hormones cannot enter the target cell directly. A hormone molecule, acting as the first messenger, binds to its receptor, causing the receptor to change shape. The receptor can now activate specific intracellular G proteins. The activation process begins with the release of a GDP molecule from the G protein in exchange for a GTP molecule. This causes the G protein to change shape and become active. The hormone-bound receptor activates many individual G proteins, which greatly amplifies the signal from a single hormone molecule. An activated G protein diffuses along the plasma membrane until it binds to and activates the enzyme adenylate cyclase. Once active, adenylate cyclase converts ATP to the second messenger, cyclic AMP. These many molecules of cyclic AMP from each activated cyclase enzyme represent a further amplification of the initial hormone signal. The increased concentration of cyclic AMP activates enzymes known as protein kinases. These activated protein kinases phosphorylate a variety of proteins within the cell. This changes the activity of those proteins and generates the cell's hormone response. The cell's response is characterized by the specific proteins present in the cytoplasm, only some of which can be phosphorylated by protein kinase. The cellular response diminishes rapidly once the hormone is no longer bound to its receptor. G proteins hydrolyze their bound GTP to GDP, returning to their inactive state, and dissociate from adenylate. This ends cyclic AMP production. Existing cyclic AMP is degraded by the enzyme phosphodiesterase, which is already present in the cytoplasm. As the cyclic AMP concentration returns to resting levels, protein kinase inactivates, preventing further protein phosphorylation. The target cell has now returned to its pre-stimulus condition, ready to respond to future hormone signals. The signal of a water-soluble hormone binding to a receptor on the plasma membrane is amplified through the activation of many G proteins and the generation of even more cyclic AMP. This cyclic AMP activates many protein kinases, which affect many thousands of intracellular proteins, all shaping the target cell's response. The response of many target cells produces the homeostatic and regulatory effects controlled by the endocrine system.
Okay, so the number one place, I don't mean number one place in terms of where most of the receptors are found. But the number one place we've talked about you're finding receptors for hormones is where? Plasma membrane. Number two possible receptor location on the target cells. Receptors in the cytoplasm or the nucleus. So now we're going inside of the cell. And the types of hormones that will bind to these receptors are the steroid hormones. These are lipid-soluble hormones. They diffuse through the plasma membrane. So obviously they have to be able to get through the membrane. So they're going to have to be lipid-soluble because you'll remember from 168 that the majority of the cell membrane is lipid, a high lipid content. It's got a lipid bilayer. And water-soluble things can't get through fats. It alters the activity of specific genes in this case. It affects the DNA transcription rate, and it changes the pattern of protein synthesis. So you'll recall that transcription has to do with turning the DNA into messenger RNA, and then we turn messenger RNA into proteins through translation. So again, the way steroid hormones are working is by affecting the DNA. So that's a little bit different than the previous hormones we were talking about. It changes the synthesis of enzymes and structural proteins that affect the cell's metabolic activity and the structure, because ultimately what you're producing from DNA to messenger RNA to proteins, in this case, are enzymes and other structural proteins. Okay, also, thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones also go inside of the cell. They're transported across the cell membrane by carrier-mediated process. That means something on the cell binds it and brings it in. So it binds to receptors on mitochondria once it's inside, and this increases the rate of ATP production. Okay, what is ATP? Just think of energy, right? It's the way we store energy. We're turning glucose into ATP in a way, and we'll use that later on. So obviously, in this case, we are impacting metabolism, and you know thyroid hormones do that. They also bind to receptors in the nucleus. They activate specific genes, or they change the rate of transcription again, the changing from DNA to messenger RNA. They affect the cell's metabolic activity and structure. Okay. So, what were the two places we find hormone receptors? One, plasma membrane, and two, so inside the cytoplasm or the nucleus. Good. Okay, let's move on. The hypothalamus. Of course, this is in the inner brain. Provides the highest level. The hypothalamus provides the highest level of endocrine function by integrating the nervous and endocrine system. So this is where they kind of come together. And there's three mechanisms of integration. You have hypothalamic neurons that synthesize two hormones, and they are then transported and released by the posterior pituitary. So antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. So this is an example where the thing that produces the hormone isn't the thing that basically secretes and releases it, right? It's produced in the hypothalamus, but it's ultimately released and secreted by the posterior pituitary. And someone asked me this in lab yesterday. Oh, yeah. So antidiuretic hormone, it's synthesized by the supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus, and oxytocin is synthesized by the periventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. But again, they are both released from the posterior pituitary gland. And this graphic simply shows what we just said. Okay, second mechanism of integration. Hypothalamus secretes regulatory hormones that control the anterior pituitary gland endocrine cells. And three, it contains autonomic centers that directly stimulate the endocrine cells in the adrenal medulla. And where's the adrenal medulla? It's in the adrenal gland. Okay? So it's stimulated in response to sympathetic division activation, and in response, the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. This is happening, this third part here is happening at the adrenal gland. But the autonomic centers of the hypothalamus are what stimulate the endocrine cells in the adrenal medulla of the adrenal gland to do this. So, as this picture shows, there's three mechanisms by which the hypothalamus has this endocrine regulation. Okay, let's talk about the hypophyseal portal system. So we're going to talk about the hypothalamus now exerting direct or indirect controls, and this is the system that's involved. This is a capillary network, has interconnecting vessels that go between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and it's one of the reasons we often call the pituitary gland the hypophysis. As a matter of fact, if you see in some of our older slides in there, some of them don't say pituitary gland, some of them actually say hypophysis. So regulatory hormones are released from the hypothalamus at the median eminence of the infundibulum, and that's a little stalk. I have a lot of detail, but then it's really pretty simple. The median eminence is just a part of it, of the stalk that holds the pituitary gland, and it moves from the interstitial fluid into the fenestrated capillaries, and we'll talk more about capillaries in another chapter. Then it's carried to the anterior pituitary and the portal vessels, which are veins, and then it forms a secondary capillary network in the anterior pituitary. So it's a pretty complex network, but it's really small because keep in mind we're still talking about the pituitary gland, which is really, really small. It allows the hypothalamic hormones to reach the target cells in the anterior pituitary directly, and it does that without mixing and diluting in the general circulation. And that's kind of important. So it is a system that sends some of these hormones directly from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And that shows the capillary network, the hypophyseal portal system. And do notice that there really is, as small as the pituitary gland is, there really is a true separation between the anterior and posterior pituitary. Okay, so the hypothalamus, one of the ways it regulates is by releasing regulatory hormones. And they are either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. In the case of releasing hormones, they're stimulatory. They stimulate production or synthesis and secretion of certain hormones by the anterior pituitary. So the releasing hormones stimulate synthesis and secretion of hormones by the anterior pituitary gland. And then the hypothalamus also releases inhibiting hormones that prevent synthesis and secretion at the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So that was one of the mechanisms in which the hypothalamus works, is by producing something that then regulates. And the regulatory hormones we just talked about were either stimulatory or they were, what's the other term? either cause release, because they're called releasing hormones, or they inhibit. Very good. Okay, now let's talk more detail about the pituitary gland itself. Small oval gland. It fits into the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Do you all remember from 168 looking at the inside of the cranium and having to remember this little indentation in the cranium, little bitty U-shaped area? That's where the pituitary gland fits. And again, the pituitary gland is extremely small. On this model that I have in my hand, it's just this little red area. You can pass it around. It's at the anterior portion of the brain stem at the top, right below the hypothalamus. It releases 9 peptides, so it releases a lot of chemicals. It releases 7 from the anterior lobe and 2 from the posterior. So the posterior pituitary doesn't release as many as the anterior part of it. The 7 that are released from the anterior lobe we call tropic hormones, because they turn on other endocrine glands. They're tropic. Those 7 released from the anterior lobe turn on other endocrine glands, so we say they are tropic. But all 9 of these hormones from the pituitary gland bind to membrane receptors. So none of these that are produced by the pituitary gland go inside of the cell. They all bind to receptors on the membrane. Remember, we said there's 2 places you find receptors for hormones, either the plasma membrane or inside the cytoplasmic nucleus. All of the pituitary gland hormones bind to membrane receptors, and they use that CAMP chemical as the second messenger. So what that means is when they bind to the cell, the chemical CAMP inside is what then activates other enzymes to start operating. Okay, in a nutshell. And by the way, we refer to the anterior lobe as the adenohypophysis, and we refer to the posterior lobe as the neurohypophysis occasionally. And as I mentioned a while ago, excuse me, the infundibulum is that stalk that you find between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Okay, now we're going to talk about the details of each of these hormones. So we are talking about the pituitary gland, which is very much under control by what part of the brain? What were we just talking about a few minutes ago? The hypothalamus. Okay, let's keep this in perspective. All 9 of these peptides released by both the anterior and posterior lobe bind where on the cell? Plasma membrane. Very good. And they cause the CAMP chemical to operate as a second messenger inside of the cell. So, let's talk about the hormones released from the anterior lobe. Number 1, thyroid stimulating hormone. And as you can imagine, it targets the thyroid gland. It stimulates release of thyroid hormones. But what causes TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, to be released? Well, it's released when thyrotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus. So this is how it's under control by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus first has to release TRH to make the thyroid gland release TSH. And the release is decreased when the thyroid hormone levels rise. And you remember when we were first talking about the endocrine system, it operates in negative feedback. So as you have more and more of the chemical produced, in this case hormone, it feeds back on itself. It knows, okay, we've got enough of it, we can stop producing it. So it operates in negative feedback. Okay? Second hormone of the anterior lobe, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, also known as corticotropin. It stimulates the release of steroid hormones from the adrenal cortex, and specifically the steroid hormones that affect glucose metabolism. And guess what? They're under control of the hypothalamus too. So the hypothalamus has to release corticotropin releasing hormone first, which then causes the anterior pituitary to release corticotropin, or ACTH. Also, gonadotropins are a part of this, of the adrenocorticotropic hormone. They regulate activities of the gonads, which of course the ovaries or the testes. And again, they're released in response to another hormone released from the hypothalamus called the gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. A third hormone from the anterior lobe follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. And by the way, this is released in both males and females. In females, FSH promotes the ovarian follicle to develop. In combination with luteinizing hormone, it stimulates secretion of estrogens. In males, follicle stimulating hormone is important to promote developing sperm to mature. And FSH is inhibited by a chemical called inhibin. And that peptide is released by the gonads. Okay, number 4, luteinizing hormone. This is released by males and females also. In females, it induces ovulation and promotes secretion of estrogen and progesterone. So it gets the female body ready for a possible pregnancy. In males, luteinizing hormone stimulates the interstitial cells of testes to produce androgens, which are sex hormones, and the primary androgen is testosterone. But again, luteinizing hormone has to be released to stimulate testosterone to be released. Number 5, growth hormone. Stimulates cell growth and reproduction by accelerating the rate of protein synthesis in your cells. And specifically, if you think about where do you have most growth, especially if we're talking about young child as they're getting larger through time going into adolescence, the skeletal muscles and the chondrocytes are going to be sensitive to growth hormone. And you remember, chondrocytes are cells found where? Where specifically in bone, though? Specifically found in cartilage. So you're going to find it at those epiphyseal cartilages where you have growth occurring, right? That'll eventually become epiphyseal plates. Once eventually they'll harden after you don't grow anymore. But at the ends of long bone, where you have in the epiphysis, you have the cartilage, and that's where the growth is occurring. And that's called endochondral ossification growth. You probably forgot that a long time ago. That's the long bone growth. But because that's where most of the growth is occurring, obviously it's chondrocytes that are sensitive to growth hormone, along with skeletal muscle. Growth hormone is regulated by 2 hypothalamic hormones, growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And actions of growth hormone can be direct or indirect. The indirect action is the primary mechanism. In this case, The liver cells respond to growth hormone, believe it or not, because they synthesize and release the somatomedins, and they stimulate tissue growth, or insulin-like growth factors. And we see these kinds of receptors on certain cells like skeletal muscle and cartilage. So what it does is it causes them to want to take up carbohydrates, glucose in particular. And obviously that makes sense if you want growth to occur. You've got to have the energy. You've got to have the food. So the response is increased uptake of the amino acids and incorporation into new proteins ultimately. So that's indirect action of growth hormone. Direct action, we see this in the epithelial and connective tissues. It stimulates stem cell division and differentiation. So growth hormone does affect epithelial and connective tissues. And it also affects adipose tissues. It stimulates the breakdown of the triglycerides. It releases fatty acids into the blood. Your tissues use the fatty acids instead of glucose, and that generates ATP. We call that glucose sparing effect. Because your skin needs to grow also as a person grows, right? And then you have direct actions by the liver as well, where it stimulates the breakdown of glycogen reserves. And you'll recall the glycogen is the way that your body, or one of the ways your body stores glucose.
Man, that's a huge spider.
Yeah.
Get it outside.
I had to take a spider break for those listening on the video. Okay, prolactin number 6. It works with other hormones to stimulate mammary gland development. In pregnancy and nursing period, it stimulates milk production by the mammary glands. It's released in response to prolactin-releasing factors. It's inhibited by prolactin-inhibiting hormone, and it's stimulated by prolactin-releasing hormone. Melanocyte-stimulating hormone, possibly released from the pars intermedia of the anterior lobe, so we're not totally sure. It stimulates melanocytes of the skin to increase melanin production, which of course gives more color to the skin. In adults, that portion of the anterior lobe is almost non-functional. And there's usually no melanocyte-stimulating hormone in circulation. And we'll talk more about that later too. And of course, we already talked about that somewhat in 168. You know, as a person gets older, you actually see less pigmentation. Okay, so those were the hormones of the anterior lobe. So there were 7. The posterior lobe, we have antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. We also call it vasopressin. It's released in response to many stimuli. The main stimulus is an increase in solute concentration of blood, and it's sensed by osmoreceptors or a decrease in blood pressure volume. Primary function to act on kidneys to retain water, decrease urination. It also causes vasoconstriction, which helps increase your blood pressure. So a lot of what's going on in your body when it comes to keeping water or releasing water has to do with your body's attempt to preserve a certain blood pressure. And release is inhibited by alcohol. Release of antidiuretic hormone is inhibited by alcohol. So antidiuretic hormone does what to you?
It brings down your blood pressure.
Okay. So it acts on kidneys to retain water and decrease urination. So you keep more water inside of you. So does that increase or decrease pressure? It increases, right? So you will not go to the bathroom as often, right? But if you inhibit ADH, like when you drink alcohol, then what happens? The opposite. you release a lot of water from the body. Number 2, oxytocin is the second one released from the posterior lobe. It's released in response to sensory input. It stimulates smooth muscle contraction in the walls of the uterus, which promotes labor and delivery. Contraction of the myoepithelial cells in the mammary glands promotes ejection of milk, and again has an unclear function in sexual activity. But we do know that the circulating levels do rise during sexual arousal. So there's the hormones of the posterior lobe. ADH, OX. So let's just go back very quickly and just name the hormones. Let's see if we can remember. Hormones of the anterior lobe. And by the way, I've posted a short video, and I'll probably show it again in the next class. It has mnemonics to help you remember which hormones are released by which organs. It's really a good little video. Okay, so by the anterior lobe, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and of course you can just remember the letters, acronym. The follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, melanocyte stimulating hormone. So those are the 7 by the anterior, and the posterior antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Okay, so one thing I keep talking about is the way that we regulate hormones is by negative feedback, where once you get so much of the material produced, it feeds back on itself, and the body says, or the cell saying, we don't need to produce anymore. That's a typical control mechanism. So the example they say is the hypothalamic releasing hormone triggers the release of hormone by anterior pituitary gland, which triggers the release of a second hormone by the target gland. The second hormone, though, suppresses secretion of both the hypothalamic releasing hormone and the pituitary hormone. So what you've got to act on in this case is the releasing hormone, right? So you don't actually get the other hormone to be released. And in some cases, as it says, both the releasing and inhibiting hormones are part of the regulatory process. So growth hormone. In the case of somatomedins, they're released by the liver. They influence the hypothalamic hormones. They inhibit the release of growth hormone, releasing hormone, and they stimulate the release of growth hormone, inhibiting hormone. And you see in that case, it makes it stronger to be released because not only are you releasing release hormone, but you're stopping any inhibiting hormone. Okay, prolactin is an example. Prolactin inhibits release of prolactin-releasing hormone, but it stimulates release of prolactin-inhibiting hormone. Again, it gives you a stronger reaction. Okay, this table just shows you how negative feedback works with certain hormones in the system. Those from the pituitary. This table, or this diagram in your book is a really good diagram to remember, by the way. You may want to focus a lot on this diagram as you're studying for your next exam. So this shows the influence of the hypothalamus on the pituitary gland. Okay, let's talk about the thyroid gland. It's located on the anterior surface of the trachea. It's inferior to the thyroid cartilage. See here, there's the thyroid cartilage at the top. Thyroid cartilage at the top. Underneath that, you find the thyroid gland. There are two lobes connected by this narrow isthmus. And the size is going to be variable depending on the person. When it comes to that gland. Contains a lot of thyroid follicles. This is something else you'll want to look at in the laboratory in the slides. They're basically hollow spheres, but they're lined by cuboidal, simple cuboidal epithelium. What does simple mean? One layer. The follicle cavity has a viscous colloid. And into that colloid, the follicle cells secrete a globular protein we call thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin contains amino acids, in particular tyrosine. And surrounding each of the follicles, you have a network of capillaries. And their purpose, transport of nutrients, waste, and the secretory products. Some important cells that you'll find in the thyroid gland are the C cells. We call them C cells because it stands for clear cells. They secrete calcitonin. That helps regulate calcium ion concentrations in the body fluids. That's another you'll be remembering. Now, one thing you might associate with thyroid gland is iodine. And where do you often see iodine listed as a part of food? Matter of fact, we add to that food intentionally salt. And it's taken up by the follicle cells because we need it for the thyroid gland. Maybe a few other places that you would get it. The enzymes convert the iodide ions to iodine atoms. They attach to the tyrosine part of the thyroglobulin. And we produce these two hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine, are called T3. So it's easy to remember T3, T4. The follicle cells will remove thyroglobulin from the follicle by endocytosis. And the lysosomal enzymes will break down the thyroglobulin. And that releases the thyroid hormones and the amino acids into the cytoplasm. And then we'll use all that extra amino acid to produce more thyroglobulin in the end. T4 is 90% of the thyroid secretions. T3 is less than 10%. They will go across the basement membrane. They go into the bloodstream. About 75% of the T4, about 70% of the T3 travel in the blood. They're going to be attached to transport proteins called thyroid binding globulins. The hormones would then be released by the proteins gradually as they move through your system. The rest of the T3 and T4 attach to transthyretin or albumin. And your bloodstream can hold about a week of reserve supply. The effects of thyroid hormone on the peripheral tissues: it increases the rate of oxygen consumption and energy consumption. In children, it can cause a rise in body temperature. It causes increased heart rate, force of contraction, results in a rise in blood pressure, increases sensitivity to your sympathetic stimulation. It's important for maintenance of your normal sensitivity of respiratory centers to any changes in oxygen and CO2. It stimulates red blood cell formation, enhances oxygen delivery, stimulates activity in the other endocrine tissues, and accelerates turnover of minerals in the bones. And I'm going to stop there, and we will continue on